Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is Webpage example, Captions. So in this video, we're going to try and tie together everything you've learned so far with an extensive example. You can see our web page here has some fairly standard formatting particularly on the headings. And then we've got those two images with some captions underneath them. And that's really where the heart of this example is going to be. There's a number of different key topics we're going to be covering. First of all, you may be wondering how to decide whether to use a type selector, a class selector, or an ID selector. So we'll take a look at that. You may also be wondering whether you should use an external or an internal style sheet. We'll see some examples of both of those in action. We'll also take a look at how to use divs in a variety of different ways. And also, you'll notice that this particular web page is centered in the web browser, and we'll show you how to do that right at the end of this video. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is set all our headings to sans serif. We'll talk about sans serif when we're talking about web design later in the quarter, but just for now, you can see the difference between the standard appearance, which is up on top, which has serifs, and then the bottom appearance, which does not have serifs. And you kind of see that bottom is a little bit cleaner. Again, we'll talk about it in more detail in another lecture. Now, this particular design choice, we want to apply to all the headings. So that means we want to use some sort of a type selector. And here's our type selector. I'm setting the font family to sans serif. And then the next question is, should this go in an internal or external style sheet? And the way to be thinking about internal versus external is this a particular style you are likely to want to use throughout your website for all the web pages on your website, or is this something specific to just this web page? Now, probably we're going to want all the headings on our website to look the same, and so this should go in an external style sheet. All right. In addition, if you look at that H1, you'll notice that, remember, the H1 is the largest size heading up at the top of the page, typically at the top of the page. You'll see that it's centered, and I've changed the colors. It's pretty boring. It's gray, but I have changed the colors. They're gray. All right. So here's how I've done that. I've set the background color to gray. I've set the foreground color to white. I've also set the text align to center. That's how that one's centered. I've set the font size to a specific setting of my choice rather than using the default to the web browser. I've also set the padding to 10 pixels. So let's take a close look at the 10 pixels here. What's the difference between setting the padding to 10 pixels versus setting the margin to 10 pixels? Well, here we take a close-up of just the center of that heading. We can see the difference. So notice at the top, that's what we actually have. Notice there's a lot of gray above and below the words, whereas with the bottom setting, which would just be if we set the margin to 10 pixels rather than the padding to 10 pixels, there's a much thinner gray border. And so what's happening here is that the background color is based on the padding. So there's 10 pixels above and below that's included and covered by the background when we set the padding to 10 pixels. If we set the margin to 10 pixels, that's the stuff outside of the border. We haven't actually drawn a border here, but basically the background color will not cover anything outside of the border, including the margins. And so that's why it appears much thinner on the bottom setting. Okay, and assuming we want this H1 to apply to all the web pages on our website, we probably do, we would put this in an external style sheet. Okay, there's a couple more things we've done with headings. Here they are right here. The H2s have lines above and below them, so we set that with text decoration. We've set the H3s to italics. And again, we want this across all of our web pages, so this goes in the external style sheet. Okay, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you see a very small text there. It's a little hard to read here on the actual web page. It's still pretty small, but it is readable. If we zoom in, we'll see that that gives credit for where I actually got the text. The photos, you will probably not be surprised here, are mine, but that text was taken from Wikipedia. And so there's a couple questions to ask. First of all, should I use a div for this, or should I use a paragraph, or should I use something else? And should I use a class for this or an ID? And in this particular case, I don't think that there's a right answer. I used a paragraph for it, but if you wanted to use a div for it, that would make sense. I gave it an ID because I was assuming that there would be only one credits on the web page. But if you thought you might want to use this credits setting in other places as well, maybe you want to put credits on the photographs, it might make sense to set this up as a class. And you can see that for this particular ID, I set the font size to extra, extra small, and I also set the font family to sans serif. So the text of the body, except for the headings and a few other places, is serif, but specifically the headings and this credit section is sans serif. Okay, let's go back to our big picture here. And as I mentioned, the main thing, the big topic here that we're going to be talking about is these images. So let's take a close look at these images. So if you look at the images, you'll notice that there's actually the image, and underneath it, there's a caption. There's a border surrounding the image and the caption is centered and in italic. So we want to figure out how to do all of those. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to treat the image and the caption as a group. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div and place both the IMG tag and the caption into that div. And I want these style elements to be the same for all the images. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a class. If we only want the styles to apply to a single image, we could give it an ID. But if we think it's going to be something we want on multiple images, go ahead and give it a class. And here's my initial take here. You can see I've created a div and I've given it a class photo. And then also I want to do some additional styling on the caption. And so I've given that a class as well. Class caption. I think that I'm going to use the same styling information for all the different captions. So I want to give it a class. I've also put a height and a width in the IMG tag for each of these images. This is actually so when the web page loads, what's going to happen here is the HTML file is going to be received first. The HTML file will probably refer, well, in this case, will definitely refer to an external style sheet. It will also refer to a bunch of IMGs. While the web browser is waiting for that style sheet to download, while in particular it's waiting for those images to download, it does not necessarily know how big the images are. So what will happen is you'll get a small postage stamp size icon showing where the image is supposed to appear. And then later, when it figures out how big those images actually are, it will resize the web page. So by putting a specific height and width here on the IMG tag, I am telling the web browser to go ahead and reserve space for that image. So we'll go ahead and create a blank area for the image as big as the space I've specified. And when the image finally downloads, it will go ahead and fill it into that space. You don't necessarily have to specify it here on the IMG. You could just specify it on the cascading style sheets on the theory that until the cascading style sheet is downloaded anyway, it's not going to know how to lay out the web pages. We will be talking about extensively about how to lay out web pages in another lecture. There's also some tricks that you can play with different pixel densities on your images. And we may talk about that in another lecture. It gets actually fairly complicated if you want to have, oh, here's the image that I want to use if this is in a low density situation where, you know, maybe it's a mid-range display or a mid-range television and HDTV it's displaying on versus this is a super high quality retinal display on an iPad or something like that. And I want two different images, one which takes up a lot of space and has a lot of pixels for that retinal display, and then maybe another one for the standard quality display. We could talk about that in another lecture. All right, here's the rules that I'm going to use for the photo and the caption. You can see that I put a border around the photo and I've added a bit of padding. And then I've told the caption it should be aligned center and the font style should be italic. And this works for our little image here. This is my old Karen Terry Molly, the Flow Pep, and this is in the middle of a dorm staff meeting. Nobody's paying attention, and she's trying to sneak the snacks off the table while we're all talking. So this works totally fine for that. But on the other image, this is what we want the other image to appear as, and it turns out it doesn't actually work. This is what happened. So what happened here? Why did it work on one but not the other? Well, what happened here is the image has a specific width, but the text does not. And what happens is because text has no natural width other than, you know, however long your sentence or paragraph is, it will expand to take up as much space as available. So a 2-month Karen Terrier puppy escapes from an enclosure. That just expanded out. It said, I am just going to take as much space as is available until I can appear on one line or until I fill the entire web browser window. So that's a problem. So our solution for this is we're going to provide a specific width on that caption. And so let's go back to our questions here. Should this be specified as a class or an ID thing? And should this be internal versus external? Well, my thinking here is each of the images may have a different width. So this isn't something that's going to be in common for all of my images. Now, it's possible you're running some sort of a newspaper and you just have a couple standard widths for all your images. So in that case, you might use a class. But in this particular case, I figured all my images could be a random widths. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a rule specifically for this image. And so this means I'm going to give it an ID. And then as far as internal versus external, well, if this is something that's going to be in common across multiple web pages, that's external. In this case, as I said, I'm assuming my widths are going to be different from one image to another, and that's specific just to this image. And so there's no reason to put that in an external style sheet that's going to get downloaded by all my other web pages on my website. This is specific to just this image. And so I'm going to go ahead and provide a width. I'm going to put it in the internal style sheet. So, there's my style start and stop tags. This is in the internal style sheet. You can see that I'm actually going to put the width on the caption, but I'm going to put the ID on the surrounding div. And the idea here is, maybe there's going to be some other things down the road that are going to be specific to this, this particular image caption setup. So by putting the ID on that whole div, I get a little bit more flexibility. And so this particular rule combines the ID. It needs to be in the escape photo, followed by the space, followed by the dot caption. So you'll recall this is actually a descendant selector. It says this will apply to anything that is contained within a element with the ID escape photo, and somewhere within that escape photo div, if there's some other element inside of that escape photo div that has the class caption, this will apply to it. And so I went ahead and said, okay, that caption that fits it, or if there's any other captions that fit this particular rule, which there aren't in this case, that's going to be width 200. And then I figured, we might want to change the caption on the other photo at some point, so I might as well go ahead and specify width for that. And this is pretty common practice. The idea being you're the website designer, you're the web page designer. Somebody else might change the contents of the web page at another time. And so you should be thinking longer term. Like, okay, right now, the image underneath, right now, that caption under the other photo, that's not wide enough to cause problems, but it could be changed by a text editor later, and they might not understand how to fix HTML, CSS problems. So better to just go ahead and specify both the widths right now. Okay, we've got photos on the left and the right. This seems like something that we would want to have on all our web pages, so that suggests it should be a class. And so I've gone ahead and specified it on my divs here. I have a right photo and a left photo class. Notice that the class actually specifies that it is both a photo, which we saw the rules for before, and a right photo or a left photo. So I didn't really mention this previously, but you can list multiple classes on your class attribute value pair in your tags. So I think this is a little odd. I think they should have separated them by commas, but they didn't. So just list as many classes as you want, just separate them by spaces. And then here's the rules for the left and the right photo. Basically, I'm floating to the left or floating to the right, and then I'm specifically setting a margin either on the left or the right. Basically, the margin is on the opposite side of where it's floating. So the idea here is it will be flush to the left, and then on the right side where the text is flowing alongside, I want a little bit of a margin between the photo and the text. Or if the photo has floated to the right, I want it flush on the right side of the web page, with a little bit of margin between on the left where the text is flowing alongside. Okay, you'll also notice that the web page is centered in the web browser. This is pretty common. How do you do that? Usually what you're going to do is you're going to add an extra div. The div is going to surround absolutely everything in the body. So you can see I have the outer body tag, and then inside of the body tag, I have a div. I've given it the ID all, and everything in the web page is in that inner div. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a rule for that inner div. And here it is. I say, oh, this is for all. And I gave it a specific width. I said the entire content should fill 1,000 pixels. And then I set the margin to auto. Margin auto allows the web browser to choose the margins on its own. And what that will usually do for the left and the right margin is just even out the left and right margin and place the item in the center. So that gives us this nice effect. Another thing that these are sometimes used for, these outer divs are sometimes used for, is if you want to put a box around the entire web page, you could go ahead and put a border around it all, and you would get a nice little back border around the entire thing. Okay, that's just about it. The last thing I wanted to mention is this use of divs is super flexible. We'll take a look at this again next lecture, and you get to play around with it a little bit in the next homework assignment. But I did want to mention for the more advanced students, the students that are planning to actually start creating real websites, particularly if you're planning to do this in a professional setting, you should be aware that HTML5 has added some new tags, which can be used in place of these divs. These pretty much will do the same thing as the divs that I created here, the div for the caption, the div for the image and the caption together. They don't generally have any styling information on their own, but they are used to tell the web browser the sort of semantic information about what this tag is supposed to be. And these can be very helpful for supporting viewers with accessibility problems, particularly if somebody can't see the screen. They're using what's called a reader, where the web browser is reading the contents to them. These can be super helpful to let those readers know what's going on. So in this particular case, there's a figure and a fig caption tag. And so these could replace my two divs, the div for the caption, obviously, where I said class equals caption, that could be replaced by fig caption. And then the outer one with a photo that could have been replaced by a figure. And then here's a list of some of the other semantic elements. I mentioned a couple of these, I think, before. So there's an article. A side is sort of like, if you've seen those textbooks where there's sort of like a blue box, you can kind of see my lame version of that in some of the chapters from the CS105 course reader, where I just mark, hey, this should go aside, but I didn't actually put it in an external box. Details, section, summary, and time. And then these might actually do something for the web browser on the bottom here. Nav, that's super helpful for people, again, that can't actually read your web page or are having the web page read to them. So nav indicates that a section is actually a navigational section. So if you've got, those, we'll talk about this later, but if you've got that common design where you've got a sidebar or a top navigation bar where you say, hey, here are some elements, here are some other web pages on my website that you can click on. By having that nav there, you can let the web browser know, hey, don't read this section to the person that's visiting my web page until they specifically say, okay, I'm done listening to what the contents of the web page are. What are my navigation options? And then the web browser can be like, oh, I see you have that nav section. Now's where I'm going to go ahead and read the nav section to my viewer. And then there's a header and a footer, which could be potentially used by the web browser to do something special on the top and the bottom. I don't think it actually is used for anything right now. It's just another tag that you can use, that you can give style rules to, the same way I've given style rules to my div with class equals photo and my div with caption. So these are all different options. And again, by providing a little bit more semantic information, you'll make it a little bit easier for the web browser to tell what it is you're trying to do. You'll also potentially make it easier for people, like if you create a web design, let's say this actually happens to some of my students. You go to some company, let's say you start up a new nonprofit with a bunch of friends. Nobody knows how to make a web page. You're it. And so you go and make the web page, but you might want other people to be able to modify that web page. So by using these special tags, you can let people know what the different parts of your HTML file are to be used for. You're providing them with a little bit more guidance in terms of what the individual sections are, rather than just having a bunch of divs. Okay, that's it. I'll talk to you guys soon. We've got a lot more cool web stuff coming. We've got extensive discussion on layout. So, I think this is already a pretty interesting web page, but we've actually got an extensive discussion on layouts, followed by how to use the technologies I'm going to be teaching you to recreate parts of the New York Times webpage and the Washington Post webpage. So you can look forward to that. I'll talk to you soon.